Hey, it's Jordan. I am delighted to be joined by Mary Grant. You are the Public Water for All Director with Food and Water Watch. And I've covered water issues a lot in Flint and elsewhere. And you do this for a living. And I wanted to talk to you because there's a really new, really interesting, and I think kind of revealing information out that you guys we're putting a statement out on about the effect of the water shutoffs on COVID, specifically the moratorium on water shutoffs. For those that don't know, major cities from Flint, Detroit, all across the country have had utilities and state governments shutting off water for residents who can't pay their bills for years and years and years. And during COVID, fortunately, that was paused for a time, since obviously you need water to clean your hands during a deadly pandemic. So could you kind of explain for the audience what were the effects in the areas and broader nationally on the pause on water shutoffs during COVID?
Sure. So we found that, so we've been tracking water shutoff moratoria across the country. So last summer in June, at the height of protections, we found that at least 2/3 of the country was protected under a water shutoff moratoria, either a local or a state protection. Since then, they've expired across the country. And so now we estimate that less than half the country is protected under a water shutoff moratorium. So millions of people are at risk right now of losing water service. A really interesting study came out on Monday from Duke University. It's a working paper. They were looking at the effect of housing protections on COVID infection rates. They found that a moratoria, even these limited patchwork protections, moratorium on water and other utility disconnections, they reduced COVID infections by 4.4% and deaths by 7%, even this patchwork one. But even more powerfully, they estimated that had there been a nationwide shutoff moratorium in effect in early March through the end of November, a national moratorium on utility disconnections, it could have reduced COVID rates by 9% and deaths by 15%. 15% of people who died could have been saved, but just by having a nationwide moratorium on utility disconnections. This is such a powerful study and information that feels intuitive to us. Of course, if you don't have running water at home, how can you stay safe? How can you protect yourself and your family? How can you protect your community? So it's intuitively true to us, but to have this hard data there and this estimate, I think is really powerful. One of the things we're doing right now, we're part of a national No Shutoffs coalition, and we're calling on President Biden and the new CDC director, Walensky, to take action and impose a nationwide utility shutoff moratorium using the same authority that they have and that they've used to impose a moratorium on evictions, to extend those protections to utility shutoffs. Because right now, cases are still high across the country. Deaths are still high. So many people have been affected, and we need to just create these protections so people can stay safe, stay home, and protect themselves.
And by the way, let's just keep it real. State governments didn't pause or do a moratorium out of kindness. It was activists on the ground, Food and Water Watch, and, people power, grassroots, that put them to shame that during a deadly pandemic, they were still shutting people's water off. That forced, I'm thinking of Mayor Dugan in Detroit, Mayor Neely in Flint, other mayors and governors. So again, this is kind of like the eviction moratorium. If not for the masses and grassroots doing this, they weren't planning to shut off water, because water, as you know for a living, water is big business in this country. And like anything else, they're willing to let people not have running water. Can you kind of talk about what, and this was the previous administration, but the fact that it was groups like you that had to fight for this moratorium in the first place?
No, and I'm glad you brought up Dugan from Detroit. It was actually Detroit was the first a major city in the country to impose a water shutoff moratorium in response to the COVID pandemic. And that's not because the mayor was a good actor. That is directly because of all of the grassroots organizing happening on the ground. Folks in Detroit, the People's Water Board, we, the people of Detroit, have been fighting for 2 decades now, 2 decades to address the water affordability crisis there. They're fighting still for an income-based water affordability plan, but they've won this strong protection. It was their fighting, their battle, and their victory that the city imposed that moratorium. And it actually, that really set off, it was the triggering event that incited cities across the country to take action and to suspend shutoffs. Because really, shutoffs aren't in the city's interest anyway. It's just a punitive measure. You're punishing people for being poor. And so communities across the country are organizing to prevent shutoffs and long term to really address the affordability crisis head on. Because it's not just Detroit, it's not just Flint, it's not just Baltimore. Cities across the country are facing really deepening crisis and affordability as rates go up and people are struggling to pay their bills. Just yesterday, a bill was introduced in Chicago that would set up this income-based water affordability plan, like folks in Detroit have been fighting for, like Philadelphia has, and Baltimore is hoping to set up by this summer. So we're going to see more and more cities, because of grassroots activism, take action and address that affordability crisis head on, keep the water on, make water affordable for all. And really to restore that public trust and confidence in the water and to improve our water systems at large.
I'd like to ask you, full caveat, obviously you're not a doctor, but I just had a 2-hour conversation on the phone with a mother from Sycamore, Illinois, which is near Chicago. And a lot of people don't know, and I'm gonna report on it when I have a chance. Sycamore, their water has been smelly for decades. Actually, in the 1940s, that local officials there said we need to change the pipes. The pipes that distribute the water are almost a century old. And I was hearing horrible stories from this mother about smelly water, discolored water, and all these things. And Sycamore, Detroit, Chicago, Flint, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, we could go on and on. Discolored water, smelly water, high lead levels, you name it. So I would think, even if the water isn't shut off, if the CDC says washing your hands repeatedly with soap, I think they say 20 to 30 seconds, is more important than, not that you shouldn't use hand sanitizer, but they specifically prioritize washing your hands. Well, if you have contaminated water, again, not a doctor, wouldn't you think you're just washing your hands with contaminated water? Maybe that's not the most sanitized measure when your life can be saved with clean water washing your hands?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the lessons that folks need to learn from Flint and the Flint water crisis is that you have to listen to residents on the ground about the safety of the water. Flint residents knew first, and they were saying it right away that the water was dirty and unsafe. And it's just, people need to change their mindset and listen to people on the ground who are directly impacted about the safety of their water. What's really horrifying to us is last year we called for the CDC to suspend water shutoffs using that emergency powers to prevent the spread of disease. We actually got a letter back from the CDC director, the former one, Director Redfield, and he told people that if your water is shut off, use dirty water. So we didn't want to promote that because we thought it was so irresponsible of the CDC to advise people to actually use dirty water to wash their hands. So we don't advise people to use dirty water. We want to invest in our infrastructure so that every person has safe water at home. We really need to make sure that people have access to safe water so that they can protect themselves, not just for drinking and cleaning and cooking. It's all the important things, and bathing, so that people can really keep safe and have access to proper sanitation.
And, I'd like to ask you, too, because you've focused a lot on water privatization. So it's Food and Water Watch. And, everybody right now, the last 2 days, is talking about the Wall Street battle between GameStop and Wall Street banks over the GameStop stock. A lot of people don't realize, because certainly the corporate media doesn't touch it, water has been quite the commodity that Wall Street has been trading over the last few years. I think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's skyrocketed to one of the top categories that hedge funds have been trading on. My suggestion is Well, if you think that there might be a shortage somewhere down somewhere down the line of clean water, you want to stock up on your shares now. Some have said, potentially the next world war could be fought over water. Can you kind of talk about the privatization element? Because a lot of people don't realize a lot of their high water rates around the country, not just in Flint, but elsewhere, is because a lot of their cities and towns have taken measures to privatize the water, leading to higher bills for them.
No, absolutely. We did a study looking at the 500 largest community water systems in the country. We found that privately owned water systems charge 59% more. And this is only going to get worse because Wall Street is really interested in investing in water utility assets and then water assets themselves, the water itself. So the water utility assets, a lot of private equity firms are interested in. We've already seen companies like the Carlyle Group get involved. They bought one company and they sold it off 5 years later and inflated the price. And so now ratepayers are responsible for paying for that. Missoula, Montana, the biggest city in Montana that had private water. Carlyle Group owned their water system. They were in the middle of a really contentious municipalization battle. The city overwhelmingly wanted public control. And then through this process, the company just ditched. They just sold it off and jacked up the price and ran away and jacked up the investment price. And so the city ended up having to pay a lot more. The Carlyle Group paid for those assets. So yeah, that's going to be reflected in rates. It was still a better deal for the city to buy it back. They were able to stabilize rates, make investments in their system. They were losing a lot of water under private ownership. So they've been able to conserve that water and really manage their resources for the future. And then even more frightening of a potential is that in October of this year, or last year, the world's first water futures market was launched on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. There was actually Wall Street is actually betting on water shortages right now. It's tied to a California Water Index. It's pretty narrow in scope and impact, but it's still a really terrifying future. You have people speculating on water, actual water speculation happening. And we've learned from the food crises that these futures trading, the derivative, these complex financial instruments, they can cause price bubbles. And that can really harm consumers. If we're already facing a water affordability crisis, what would happen if water were traded like a commodity? So this is something we really need to fight right now, and we have to prevent that further commodification and financialization of our water. These complex financial instruments have no role in sound financial management. It is not a responsible way to manage our water resources. It just turns water into a plaything for investors, I heard someone say. So we really need to protect water as a public trust resource. This is owned by the people. It's a common resource, and it's held in public trust for the people, by the people. We really need to make sure that we're preserving water as a public trust across the country.
And I want to move back to something you said, because I think it ties to Wall Street. There's been a really, to me, reckless media trend in recent years, specifically with Flint, since obviously everybody knows what happened in Flint, of just taking state of Michigan environmental officials' data and word for it that the water is now meeting EPA regulations. I mean, I got the back problems to prove it. My partner and I knocked on 450 doors in 2018. We found that the environmental department was manipulating the testing. They were running people's water before taking the test, not the night before, right before. And voila, they said, the lead levels are back to normal. And they shut down the water stations and all that. And why I think that's important, Food and Water Watch knows, public utilities all over the country game the system in testing. They have been exposed that sometimes they throw out a lot of high lead tests so that they get their overall number down, because if their overall average is higher than what the EPA allows, then they have to spend money to remediate and fix it. So to me, not only is Politico just did a piece. It was unconscionable. Flint's water is safe. Why don't people trust it? I guarantee you that Politico writer never has stepped foot or spoken with Flint residents. So why that's important is Wall Street would have an interest, if they're betting on all this, of keeping up a facade that the water is fine in places, because probably not good for water if you're having water crises everywhere in the country for Wall Street's investment. So can you kind of talk about that connection between Wall Street as an interest in misleading the public on the safety of water?
Sure. I mean, Wall Street, our water systems are largely funded by bonds and debts. So Wall Street owns a lot of the debt that municipalities have. So they have a direct financial interest in people paying their water bills. And that's why utilities shut off water services in order to pay back their bond holders, their bond buyers. So, I mean, Wall Street has a huge financial interest. We used to have federal support for our water systems. It used to be funded by progressive taxes, right? The federal government used to provide a substantial amount of money for our water systems. But federal funding for water peaked in 1977. Since 1977, it's fallen by 77%, according to CBO estimates, the Congressional Budget Office. So a 77% decline in real terms in federal investment in water. So that's austerity, right? It's this heart of austerity is driving municipalities to cut back on infrastructure investment. So they're not making as many investments. They're deferring maintenance. So systems are deteriorating. They're also pushing all the costs onto ratepayers. And water rates are so regressive. And without that federal support, they're having to rely almost entirely, 90% of water infrastructure is financed by municipal bonds. So Wall Street bond buyers holding all of this debt. This was a big piece in the Detroit bankruptcy too. And when they spun off and created, against the will of the people of the city, created a new regional authority without going through that public vote required by the Detroit Charter because of the bankruptcy.
And by the way, that was a big issue with the Flint water crisis. A lot of people don't realize, because the media, doesn't like to report on anything having to do with financial corruption. Flint, the only reason they were on the Flint River is because there was a new pipeline being constructed, and Flint, allegedly, I'll say, but it actually was fraudulent. Flint was put on a bond deal. You were talking about the bonds. Flint was allowed to borrow $85 million to join this new pipeline that they should have never been allowed to borrow. And that's why Flint water rates are still so high, because somebody's got to pay back those bonds, which, by the way, JP Morgan and Wells Fargo were the banks involved with that.
Yeah. And also, there were years of emergency managers in Flint increasing water rates to pay back general fund debt too, not just the water debt, but general fund debt. So all the bonds, the general obligation bonds too, that they were using water rates as a way to tax people through the tap to pay back those, basically to give money to Wall Street. So yeah, I think that's a huge part of what's happening, and that need to repay bond buyers is really driving a lot of issues for cities, and that loss of federal support is really at the heart of the issue, and the lack of a progressive funding stream. We really need to get a more progressive funding stream, make corporations pay their fair share, so that households, low-income households, struggling folks, working folks aren't just being pushed off water systems or being left with dirty water. I mean, just like with school funding, if your water system is funded only by the people in the community, if you're a low-income community, that means you don't have the funding you need. Just like with a school system, it's funded by property taxes of the neighborhood. So you have rich people with high quality water, and then poor neighborhoods, low income neighborhoods, black and brown neighborhoods with dirtier water or higher water bills and more shutoffs. So we really need to change that dynamic. We really need to inject some justice into the system to make sure that we're funding things in a progressive way that prioritizes communities with the most need.
And lastly, circling back to COVID, listen, honestly, nobody knows how long this is going to go. You got 2 now mutations, South Africa, UK, from what the medical experts are saying, more contagious, possibly more deadly than COVID-19. So frankly, they're putting all these moratoriums as kind of little stopgaps. We've moved the eviction moratorium to March. Well, I don't think the crisis is going to be over by March. And I don't think the need for clean water to sanitize yourself is the need for that is going, well, we need a need for that, period, COVID or not. So Biden has said a lot of big words on the campaign trail and now as president about the character of the nation, the soul of the nation, what is and what is not a human right. shouldn't the discussion be escalated to why are people paying for water in the first place when we're the richest country on earth and we could just provide it free at the point of service? If you want, it could be part of your taxes, a modest increase in taxes. But why, there are conversations about some towns and cities are starting to make transportation free. Why should our water not be free?
No, and I think that's an important conversation that needs to happen, because right now we have two things, opportunities at the federal level. It's the COVID relief bill. We need to forgive water debt. We need to cancel all water debt. Right now, people are accruing debt during the moratorium, even in the absence of moratorium. So we need to cancel all water debt. Just forgive everyone's water debt. It's kind of outrageous that people are losing homes and being evicted over water bills. It's completely outrageous. And we also need to, as part of the infrastructure stimulus, change how we pay for water. We shouldn't be relying on ratepayers. Water is not a commodity. It is so regressive to use water bills to fund water infrastructure. So that's why in Congress right now, hopefully soon, will be reintroduced a bill called the Water Affordability, Transparency, Equity, and Reliability Act, the Water Act. It's being introduced by Representative Brenda Lawrence and Ro Khanna in the House. And the Senate by Senator Sanders. And it would fully fund our infrastructure, meeting the EPA needs assessment. And you know how we're going to fund it. In the House version of the bill, it would roll back a tiny portion of the Trump administration's corporate income tax cuts. Just a tiny rollback of corporate income tax cuts by the Trump administration would fully fund our water infrastructure. I mean, this is a matter of priorities. It's a matter of political will. We don't have a funding issue. We have an issue with our priorities and the political will. It's because we need to make sure that water is protected as a human right, that everyone has access to water. And how we're going to get there is by passing the Water Act and making sure that we're fully funding our water infrastructure through a progressive revenue stream.
And I would say we have an issue of political corruption because Biden and Republicans, they're hoarding money from the same Wall Street banks that are using water as a commodity. So kind of a conflict of interest there. Mary Grant, thank you so much. You are the Public Water for All campaign director at Food and Water Watch. We'll definitely keep in touch as more develops with COVID and other matters related to water. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.